Okay, I want to welcome everybody to the program. It's the middle of the week. It's a Wednesday evening over here, and I wanted to do another study lesson. I've been having trouble getting a conversation going. I've been trying to reach out to some new people, trying to get some new faces, some fresh blood, as it were, in the discussion room. And it's really, really difficult. I think a few people may have gotten burned during some of our discussions that we had, over the last couple of months. Maybe they felt that some other people were being too aggressive, and it's really difficult now for me to get a good conversation going, especially getting, some more conservative people in the room. That's what I've been trying to do for some time. I've been trying to get conservatism back into the discussion panel. And it's just so difficult. But anyways, we're going to be working on that, and as well, we're going to be doing some more debates. So keep tuned, stay tuned to that. There's going to be a lot of good stuff coming up. But I have here one of my favorite books, and this is actually one of the books that that has really influenced me over the years. I came across this in 2008. It was right after I accepted, right after I became a premillennialist. It's called "How to Study the Bible." It's by I.M. Haldeman. It's an amazing book. It's probably one of the two theological books that have really influenced me besides the Bible. The other book being "How to Enjoy the Bible" by E.W. Bullinger. So you got how to study the Bible and how to enjoy the Bible. And one of the things I like to do on this channel is I like to give kudos and props to actual theology. And so this is not just, I've said this before, this is not just me, coming up with my own views, through my own private interpretations of scripture. This is actually me also studying theology, seeing what theologians in the past have said. And so I wanted to do this one on the two seeds of Genesis chapters 4 and 5. And it just so happens that I was thumbing through this book the other night, and I came upon this excellent synopsis, which I probably read about 3 or 4 times, but it didn't really occur to me. This is where I got at least some of my own theology from. But I think it's really important that we go back, because you'll hear a lot of people say that AD 70 is where the story ends. If you're a conversant in preterist circles, if you've been listening to IO, and it's really hard to avoid IO nowadays if you're in any preterist circles, you'll see the story ended in AD 70. Then when you actually go back to the topology, though, you actually go back to biblical topology, and you start seeing what was going on during the generation of Moses's time. You say, how could that be? 40 years in the wilderness was when they entered the land. That's when they were to apply everything that they were being taught during that 40 years. And so I've always felt that to be extremely important, even before I heard of IO or heard of some of these new full preterist positions that are coming out. And I just wanted to go through, because I think we see the two seeds facing off in the first century. We see, the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. We see them facing off, but they had already faced off centuries before in early Genesis. And so I want to go through some of this, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just basically going to give some of my elucidations upon the two seeds. So this little study here, it's called Genesis 4th and 5th. And if you want to do some research on your own, this book was published by Baker Bookhouse. It was actually, it actually went, it got lost for many decades. It was originally published in 1904, and Baker released it in 1963. And so I have the second printing, but it's an excellent book. It's available online too on archive.org. It's called How to Study the Bibles by I.M. Haldeman, who's the pastor of the First Baptist Church in New York City. And he was an early dispensationalist, but I will say this, that he's probably more akin to my views than anybody else in that movement would be. So anyways, he opens up with Genesis chapter 4, and he says, while this chapter sets forth the way of Cain and the way of Abel, it might properly be called the way of Cain or the fruit of the flesh. So he goes into Eve's, what he considers to be Eve's mistake. And he says in the first verse, we find she bears a son. And when he is born, says, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And then he points out there's a translation issue. He says, properly rendered, she would say, I've gotten a man, even the Lord. And so he reasons that Eve understood the seed promised in the third chapter to mean a divine son. She believed Cain to be that divine son. She believed that through him she would gain the victory over Satan in this world. And we thus learn that the promised seed in its full import meant a son whose father is God, whose mother is a woman, hence a divine human son, son of man, and son of God. Okay, so it goes on and on. But what we have here is, I don't know if you remember in Genesis chapter 3, they were told, you may eat of every tree of the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. On the day that you eat that tree, you will surely die. And of course, they ate the tree. Their eyes were opened. They tried to cover themselves with their own works. And then there was a sacrifice that was slain. And so that death penalty fell on a substitute. And then, of course, God took the skins from those animals, or from the animal, and clothed their nakedness. He provided a human, or actually, I should say, a divinely made covering to replace their human-made covering. And so, I mean, Martin Luther was on the right track. I don't care what anybody said. I'm not a huge fan of Luther, but he was right on the right track, and I don't think he even made the correlation between imputed righteousness in Genesis chapter 3. But I think if he came close, then other people certainly saw it after him. So we see this in some of the more popular evangelical literature of the 19th century and, of course, the early 20th centuries, where you have this sacrifice in the garden that took place, whereby the nakedness of Adam and Eve got covered. And even John Lightfoot in the 17th century, he even wrote about this. So they're driven out of the garden. And then, of course, the cherubim are placed at the entrance of the garden, so they can't come back in. They're barred out of the garden. And yet they're given this, I guess you can even say that Adam was the first. He was given the gospel, and he was to carry it forth. So the promise of the seed of the woman was to be perpetuated throughout his line, throughout his generations. And of course, when they had their first son, she thought that, it was the seed of the woman. That's what she herself was thinking, because when the promise was given, of course, she was the only woman in the world at that time. She, how would she have understood that? Of course, it was going to be applied directly to her. And we find that once Cain is born, then they have a second son called Abel. And this is where you see the two seeds. This is where you see mankind is divided. There's two seeds. There's a good seed and there's an evil seed. And the evil seed is the seed of the serpent, and the good seed is the seed of the woman. And so we have to get this right down. In Genesis chapter 4, we see these two seeds, and then they face off. So when we look at the two offerings, because remember that when Cain slew Abel, it was because Cain offered an offering of the fruits of the ground, and Cain had brought of the firstlings of the flock. Abel's sacrifice was acceptable to God because it was an offering. It was a slain offering. But Cain's offering was not acceptable to God. Cain's offering was from the cursed ground. Plus it was a product of his own fleshly works. And so Haldeman observes, he said that Cain's offering, in making this offering, note firstly that Cain denied any difference between himself and God. Second, he denied that death as a judgment and sentence of God was upon him. Thirdly, he denied that death must be met and canceled before he could be accepted of God. So we're going back to this concept of the sacrifice being, a vicarious substitutionary atonement. And this goes right back to Genesis chapter 3. So it's pertinent to see this in the offering of Abel, to see this concept of vicarious substitutionary sacrifice. 4, he denied that he was a fallen man needing to be reconciled to God by the death of a substitute. 5, he repudiated the idea that the ground was cursed. 6, testified on the contrary that the ground was good, that the fruit of that ground was acceptable unto God. And then he goes on to say, he says, there's those that teach that, number one, there's no distance morally between the natural man and God. They deny that man has ever been driven out of God's presence or that he is a fallen being. Deny that death is a penal infliction, the witness of God's judgment against man. They do not believe death's claim must be met before God by the death of a victim, a substitute. So all this was pointing to Christ. And there are people out there that will tell you, oh, you could be saved just by being good, just by working in the soup kitchen and, feeding the homeless and all that. And that's a necessary part of our, of a Christian witness, I would say, but certainly not before God. It certainly doesn't justify a man. He denied that human nature was under the curse. So this goes on, and you could take a look at this on your own time. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But he points out, he says, this is the way of Cain. And then he says, there are some facts of the history which are indisputable. The ground out of which Cain took his offering had been judged and cursed by God. In offering the fruit of the ground, Cain offered that which God had judged and condemned. So he's going to go on. And then, of course, he's going to talk about talk about Abel's offering. And after saying, of course, he can say, offering God our own righteousness, our own good deeds, our own mere human goodness, we deny God's judgment, trample it underfoot, and insult him because we offer him that which he has himself condemned and refused. So he goes on to mention the sacrifice of Abel, which was an offering, was a slain lamb. It was a big contrast to Cain's offering in respect to aesthetics. And it was a repulsive, it was bloody offering. I mean, who likes that? Who likes the killing of animals or the killing of anything, really? But in this case, it was the sacrifice that God had appointed. It was the only means by which man could come back to God. So if you remember the mercy seat that covered the ark, there were two angels. It was fashioned out of a single piece, but there were two angels that was of beaten gold, and there were two angels at either end, and they looked down at the sprinkled blood, because remember, they were stationed. The cherubim were stationed outside the garden with a flaming sword to keep man from coming back into the garden. But here in this mercy seat, this throne of mercy, we see them looking to where the blood would be sprinkled on the Day of Atonement. So that covers, man. In fact, the tablets of the law were placed inside the ark. And so this is a covering. This is a capora or a caporeth. Milton Terry has some great comments. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book. Let's see if I can find it. Well, I won't be able to find it. It's called The Mediation. It's called The Mediation of Jesus Christ by Milton Terry. It's actually very good. And he, with all his scholastic, brouhaha, so to speak, he even gets into that with the mercy seat. I wish I could find the passage real quick. I would. Well, here we go. So Milton Terry, he wrote in this book, the golden lid. He's talking about the mercy seat. It covered the two tables of the testimony, which were placed within the ark, and there, from above the mercy seat, Jehovah promised to meet and commune with Moses. Into this place, the high priest entered alone once in the year and sprinkled the mercy seat with blood to make atonement for the children of Israel. The slab of gold that's fitted to cover the top of the ark was called in the Hebrew the caporeth. And this word is elsewhere translated in the Septuagint as hilasterion. And he goes on and on and on, but there was something, he had said something about, here we go. The mercy seat was a golden covering over which were the faces and wings of the cherubim. It had no propitiatory significance until the priest sprinkled it with blood of atonement. So in the figure, it is only after Christ has entered the holy place through his own blood that God set him forth as a mercy seat and exhibited the saving mystery of eternal redemption through faith in his blood. And so what it does is it covers the broken law. I think he says that somewhere. Remember that the law was broken. So Moses, he gave them the law. God wrote the commandments on the two tablets, and then when they broke the law, he broke the tablets. And so then of course he had to refashion them. But this is the thing: the law was broken. And so what does the blood do? The blood covers the broken law. Remember, now in the garden, they had a law too. They were told to eat of every tree except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so they broke that law, but the sacrifice that was slain, that blood of the sacrifice would cover that broken law. So we're all sinners by nature. We need something better than human covering to cover our nakedness, to give us a righteousness that we could never get elsewise than by the blood of Christ. And so I think this is, I see the gospel all throughout early Genesis. There are, of course, some people who don't, but Haldeman goes on to say that the slain lamb, that the death was a judgment of God against him, that the judgment was just, and that as a sinner he ought to die. By offering a lamb, he confessed that his only hope before God was in a substitute to take his place. And so this is a difference. This is the difference between, say, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, because the seed of the woman will typically accept this idea of sacrificial substitutionary atonement, whereas the seed of the serpent has always been, let's do this by our own works. Remember the Roman Catholic Church persecuting thousands of Christians who disagreed with her on minor issues or even major issues like, the Trinity. But she always went after them, right? She soaked her own clothes, her own vestments with the blood of the saints. And that's what human man-made religion does. But it says right here, number 5, he believed that God could accept a slain lamb as his substitute because he had been taught the doctrine by his parents and the story of how God had provided them a covering, that is, an atonement in the coats of skins at Eden's gates through the death of a selected victim. Abel therefore offered the lamb as a sacrifice and a substitute unto God, and in offering the lamb, he owns the judgment, the justice, and at the same time the grace of God in providing for him a way of escape. And offering it, he took God at his word and glorified him. So that's the gospel pretty much in a nutshell. And that's what happened during the first century when these two seeds, they faced off. You had Christ, the seed of the woman, and then, of course, you had the seed of the serpent, who were, they were bent to destroy him. They were, at any rate, they were going to deliver him to Pontius Pilate. They were going to have him crucified. And that's what happened. And what happened 40 years later was their eviction from the land. Now, Haldeman, he's going to get into this. He's going to get into this eviction. But I want you to see the very close parallel between what happened in the first century in the Cain and Abel story. I've often said that Cain and Abel story is actually the first century was a reboot of the Cain and Abel story. And he's going to go into this. He's going to say, he's gonna talk about the two sacrifices and how one was accepted. The Abel's offering was accepted, and of course Cain's offering was not. And then he's going to talk about the verse that says, "If thou offerest well, shalt thou be accepted." And he's saying that what the divine author is saying in this story is that Cain's offering was not acceptable, and a sin offering lieth at the door. So I've seen this. I've actually seen this interpretation before. I think Bullinger says the same thing. So he says, I forget the exact verbiage, but he said, sin offering lieth at the door, croucheth at the door. And I don't have time to get my Bible, but he says the expression sin lieth at the door. In the Hebrew, the word for sin is sin offering, and lieth is crouching. Wherefore the Lord says, flocks of sheep and goats are crouching at the tent door. Go get one of these and bring an offer for a sin offering, as Abel did, and like him be accepted. Thus God the Lord preaches the gospel to him. He says, behold the sin offering. This is what I want, not your flowers and your fruit. I want the sin offering, and it is right there, right at the very door, easy to obtain. It's already crouching at your hands. Take it and offer it to me, and I will accept you, even as I have accepted Abel. So, I mean, this was Cain's opportunity. If he had seized it, what a different epilogue might have been written upon his life. And this is Haldeman points out, this is the opportunity today. God says to man, I do not want your flowers and fruit. I do not want the works of your flesh, no matter how good. I want the sin offering. Bring me that, and I will accept you, and you need to have no trouble to get it. Behold, it is at the door. Yea, it is nigh thee in thy word. The word of faith, which we preach, that is, Jesus is the sin offering, provided by my grace. Offer him unto me by faith, and I will accept you. Confess him crucified and risen from the dead for you, and you shall be saved. So, what's going on here? So Adam, apparently he taught his children that this is how we are to approach God. And Cain, apparently he wanted to do it his own way. And so he was going the way, this is the way of Cain. I've been very much beset by people who, they add things to God's plan of salvation. As a matter of fact, I wrote a community post this morning about, faith is the only requirement for salvation is faith in what God's already done. That's it. Faith in Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, ascended. That's it. And yet people will add their ABCs and their P's and Q's to God's plan of salvation. And they'll say, well, you have to do this and you have to do that. And you have to believe. And what it does is, it even gets more subtle than that, where they say, well, yeah, you have to believe. Believe is, it's not about works. It's all about faith. But they said, well, you have to believe in this and this and that and this and that and this. And you got to believe in this creed, and you got to believe in, you got to believe you have to, in order to believe this, you've got to believe this, and this first. And so they basically make it impossible for people to be saved. I mean, go down, go to your nearest church and go down the pews and, ask people what they think about this. All these things that you're saying are essential for salvation. Most of these people probably don't read their Bibles. If they do read their Bibles, they don't have a very accurate view of doctrine, right? But they believe in Jesus Christ. Right. So they're saved because they believe in Jesus Christ, but they may not line up doctrinally and, meet all of these standards and all of these requirements that people put forth as necessary for salvation. So that's really one of the ways where people fail, especially teachers fail, is they try to add all this stuff to the faith, simple faith in Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, and ascended. And then, of course, there's another more subtle error, which is, well, I'm not going to tell people that they have to, do works or anything, but I'm going to tell them, well, if you're saved, you should want to do all of this stuff. Or if you're saved, you're going to do all this stuff if you're truly saved. So they say, well, you gotta go to church, you gotta tithe, you gotta sign a church covenant, you gotta do all of this extra stuff, you gotta, and that's not actually true. The thief on the cross wasn't asked to do any of that. The Philippian jailer wasn't asked to do any of that. The Ethiopian eunuch wasn't asked to do anything other than believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. And I have a problem with people who keep adding to God's salvation. I had a conflict with someone, a couple of weeks ago, where he keeps saying, well, you need to believe this and this and that and this and this and that and this and this. And it just goes on and on and on forever. They're adding to God's salvation. they're adding to, they're putting burdens on people. They're putting burdens. They're like the legalists that would just write these grievous, these grievous burdens, but they won't touch them with one of their fingers. So with them, it's, I'm going to be saved the way I feel it, is right to be saved. I can study my Bible and I can figure it out for myself. I have the Holy Spirit. I can do this myself, right? So I'm going to be saved according to my understanding, but you, and you have to be saved according to my understanding as well. And that's simply not how it works. So moving on, so Haldimand's going to talk about murder, about Cain's crime. And now he says, now this is what he says, and this is kind of a controversial teaching, and we're going to go through whether he was anti-Semitic or not. But he says, in this crime of Cain, we have a type of the crime of the Jew against his Lord. So now if you preach this in a church today, you get chased out with a bat. But what we need to remember is Haldimand wasn't anti-Semitic. He was actually preached the future conversion and blessing of the Jewish people. But what he's pointing out is that in AD 70, after they delivered Christ up to Pontius Pilate, their city was destroyed. They were evicted from the land just much as Cain was. And then they've been wandering ever since. This is actually, I think this is a fair correlation, although we want to make a very crisp distinction between the two seeds, because remember, you can't say that the Jews are the wicked seed. You have to make this distinction because Paul speaks of an election according to the remnant of grace. And so it's not all the Jews weren't evicted from the land in AD 70. It was the wicked seed that got evicted from the land. The remnant, according to the election of grace, are those who accept Christ. They're the seed of the woman. And so you've always had these two seeds within Israel, where you have those who have held fast to the promises and who have believed by faith in what God promised. And then you have those who, take sides with the Gentile oppressors and who persecute the righteous. And those have always been the seed of the serpent. They were the seed of the serpent before Israel was even a nation. And we see this in Cain. So he says, Cain is a type of the Jew, Abel of Jesus. Proof of this may be found by reading Hebrews 12:24. Here the blood of Jesus is contrasted to that of Abel. The blood of Abel cried aloud from the ground for judgment. The blood of Jesus speaks from the mercy seat in heaven for better things, for grace toward the sinner. And so it's a type, anti-type. So Abel's blood cried for vengeance, but Christ's blood actually cried for forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And that's why they were granted that 40-year period where they were being told to accept the offer of the kingdom. And he would come and all these prophecies would be fulfilled. Of course, we know that never happened, but Haldimand points out that the point common to Jesus and Abel is the fact that both were slain in their deaths the result of fratricidal blows. This commonality is the basis of the type. Abel slain by his brother after the flesh is a type of Jesus slain by his brother after the flesh, that is, by the Jew. And that the Jew is intended in this contrast is evident from the fact that occurs in the epistle to the Hebrews, an epistle written especially to the Jews. It sets forth the idea that although the blood of Christ was upon the people, even as they invoked it according to Matthew 27:25, it was not upon them for judgment, but for grace. Thus, in Cain killing his brother Abel, you have a picture of the Jew killing his divinely sent brother Jesus. And then you have, of course, Cain's punishment. So story of Cain's punishment confirms the thought that Cain is a type of the Jew. He was driven from his home. He could get nothing from tilling the ground. He was to be a wanderer on the face of the earth. A mark was to be put upon him by the Lord that all the world might know him. All hands were to be against him. Although punished of God, God would punish those who killed him. See how wonderfully these characteristics have been fulfilled in the Jew. 40 years after the crucifixion, the Jew is driven out of his own land. He has never succeeded in tilling the ground. He has never succeeded as a farmer. For 20 centuries, he has been a wanderer on the face of the earth. for 20 centuries, he has been so marked by the hands of God that no matter among what nation he may dwell, he cannot hide himself. A Jew is known on sight everywhere. All hands were against him. Bippity boppity boo. It goes on, and of course it says that while God punishes him, he will punish all who maltreat him. And then nations persecuting him have passed away. He remains. A fearful retribution yet awaits European nations on account of him. So he's not talking about the Jews being, forever lost. He's talking about that they're preserved for a purpose. And of course, we find out when we read the epistle of Romans, we find there will be a recalling. They're about to be cut off from the olive tree. They're about to lose their religious privileges. And then the Gentiles are to be grafted in. In other words, they're going to inherit the religious privileges that Israel lost. But there's a future, once the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, there's a future regrafting in of those natural branches. So, it's something to ponder on. We don't we don't want to confine the type strictly to the Jew. It was the wicked seed that got evicted in AD 70. But we know the wicked seed went out and built a civilization, and they did their own thing. They established their own religion. And this religion, in some sense, comes into conflict with the righteous seed at a future point. When we read about the story of the Nephilim, you could call them Nephilim, with the sons of God, intermarrying with the daughters of men. You could say that that's a supernatural story about angels mating with men, but I don't think it is. I think that it's about the Canaanic civilization corrupting the civilization of Seth, of the sons of God. And it's because of that moral corruption that God eventually decides to bring a flood on the earth. So, I did a study lesson a couple weeks ago called "What's Next" I think it's called "What's Next in Prophecy," and I point some of these things out that you have to get the topology right, because after Cain slew his brother, he was evicted from the land, and so you have to have, prior to this flood occurring, you have to have an eviction. And then you have to have these two civilizations coming into contact. And if you think about it, this has been part of the history of Western civilization. You have two civilizations that have been conflicting. You've got the civilization of Christianity, and then you've got the civilization that despises Christianity. And they've been going back and forth for centuries. And then even within Christendom, you have two seeds. You've got the holy seed that fears God and tries to keep his commandments. And then you've got the wicked seed that basically, stomps all over them and persecutes them. And you see that going throughout history as well. So he talks about the civilization that Cain established. He said it was a civilization composed of, denominated by music, art, manufactures, polygamy, murder, and it was filled with music, art, and beauty, as well with industry, in making it a beautiful place to live in. But it originated with a murderer, and it just denied the effects and consequences of sin. So we have this beautiful world that we can live in, and we can, is so beautiful, and we all just need to get along. But we know that's not really true, because man is a sinner. His nature is corrupt. He's got a corrupted human nature, and he's prone to sin. I think total depravity, the doctrine of total depravity, has often been maligned, but look, if you're a critical scholar, you know that the Jehovistic, if you believe in the priestly and Jehovistic accounts of the documentary hypothesis, the scholars, the top tier scholars will tell you that the Jehovistic writer always speaks of man as completely completely no good. Nothing good can come from man. The priestly writer is the one who is saying that the man is good. All, he's good. He can do righteousness. But the Jehovistic writer, he has a different view of anthropology than the priestly writer. So if you want to get fancy and take that approach, which I certainly don't, but they will point that out. Even Yale theologians will point that out, that the Jehovistic writer does speak of man being totally depraved. So more stuff to look at, but can human nature be redeemed without Christ? And my answer would be no. There's a there's a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. It's called The Garden of Earthly Delights. If you look at that painting, you'll see, and I've been an admirer of Bosch's artwork for a long, long time, and I like to try to interpret his symbolism. Very difficult in some of his paintings to interpret his symbolism, but I've come to the conclusion that the Garden of Earthly Delights is just this concept of man trying to make this world look beautiful, trying to make life as beautiful and as attractive as possible. But when you start looking at what's going on, you see sin. You see it's corrupt, it's wicked to the core. You see people naked, fornicating. You see, you just see it's corrupt. But if you look at it from, just at a first glance, wow, this is beautiful. This must be heaven. But then you look closer and it's filled with sin. And that's that's what the Cainitic type of civilization wants you to think. They want you to think, well, we've got all this artwork and we've got all this music and this talent and this scholarship and all of this technology, and it doesn't save. It can't save man. Never has. So Haldeman says, consider morally the earth represents human nature, and no matter how much man might build cities and establish luxury or fine arts, he would never succeed in establishing a perfect society. Just as the earth would fail and come short of full fruitage, no society would fail to reach the place of perfect strength. So he's going to go on and on about that. And then he talks about the other seed that was appointed in place, ostensibly in place of Abel, but he's really appointed as a seed in the place of Cain. So here we come back to this duality, this election principle where the first is set aside and the second is appointed. Adam failed, so Christ was the second Adam was chosen, right? Esau failed, Jacob was chosen. Saul failed, David was chosen. And it goes on and on and on. We see this constant theme of duality going on throughout the Bible. And it starts really it starts in the garden, but it might start even before the garden. It might start in like Genesis 1-2, where the earth became without form and void. And there was some kind of cosmic rent in the universe, as some scholars say. And so the temporary heavens had to be created as a temporary, like a tabernacle, right? So a tabernacle is always transitory, but we know that that there's a series of types. There's a series of shadows, or what you might call stop gaps and postponements, running along the way until you get to Christ, who is the pleroma. So we have a series of fillings, and I think it might be in Matthew chapter 8 we find that word first used. It's spoken of. Pleroma is spoken of as something that you fill in. That you use to patch up like a rent. He's talking about the wineskins, something to fill it up. Well, we have all of these fillings. We have Adam was a filling, Noah was a filling, Samuel was a filling, and all these fillings. But then Christ is the fullness. He's the pleroma, and he's the one who's eventually going to heal the creation. He's the one who's going to patch up this rent, which probably occurred in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. There's a very excellent article by Charles H. Welch. It's called The Pleroma. If you have a chance, look it up. I do believe it's available online. He goes into this concept of no fullness without fulling. It's there has to be the fuller. The fuller has to full the cloth underfoot, but eventually, it's used to patch up the rent. So I don't know. I think that the first creation was accounted as wicked, right? And so it's going to be replaced by a new heaven and new earth. But in the meantime, God does his reparative work. He tries to repair it with Adam, and then of course Adam fails, and then he tries to repair it with Noah, and then Noah fails, and then he tries to repair it with Moses, and even though Moses fails. He tries to repair it with Saul. Saul fails. He tries to repair it with David. David fails. He tries to repair it with Solomon. Solomon fails. And it goes on and on and on. The only one who didn't fail, the only one who truly accomplished all of God's will was Jesus Christ. And so he says, Haldeman writes that Seth is appointed ostensibly in the place of Abel. He is really appointed as a seed in the place of Cain. That is to say, Cain is set aside as being in the image of fallen man, his father, in order that he may give way to another appointed of the Lord. In his appointment of the second man, you have anticipatively the law which Paul lays down in 1 Corinthians 15:46, first the natural and then the spiritual. First the man in the flesh and then the man from heaven. So he goes on with and this is so it's a new generation. So there was an old generation and then there was a new generation, and this is really worth reading. So he says Cain was the firstborn, but neither Cain nor Abel nor their posterity are mentioned. I think he's talking about Genesis 5. And the reason for the omission is clear to spiritual apprehension. Seth has been appointed as the new seed. The generation through Cain is not to be counted at all. We get an entirely new generation, and as in this new generation, men call upon the name of the Lord or call themselves by the name of the Lord, and men only call themselves by the name of the Lord when they are regenerated. This new generation of Adam stands typically for regeneration. So you have generation, the generation of Cain, and then you have regeneration, the generation of Seth. So it's an interesting view. I think the author of Genesis, and I do believe in the Mosaic author of Genesis, but what I believe in is Moses. I don't think Moses wrote the whole thing. When we say Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, what most of us mean, well, I'm going to speak for myself. What I mean is that Moses, and if Moses didn't finish it, someone from his school or someone from his immediate circle probably did. So he had secretaries, and someone else took that down. I don't believe in the exilic theory, only because there's if it was that late, there's things that should have been mentioned that weren't mentioned. They were getting all of these old, Babylonian, myths and stuff. They were patching it together. I think that's really a clumsy way to approach Genesis. So we could say that it was the Hebrews, actually. They were the ones who had a tradition that Moses did pen Pentateuch, and Christ even said, search Moses's writings. So it was Moses and his school, Moses and his secretaries who probably took all of this down. And I don't think we need to go much beyond that. But what it tells is, it tells a true story. If they were simply literary craftsmen and they didn't have any inspiration, or they didn't have any, you might even call it second sight, boy, they did a really great job of predicting what would happen in the first century, didn't they? I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. Just like, the people in the first century, they had a really great job of understanding early Genesis. I don't know how they did it. I really don't know, unless there was a pure faith that had been passed down from generation to generation that didn't have anything to do with the faith of the scribes and the Pharisees, because they didn't know anything about this. But what we find in the first century is we find all of these things sort of recapitulating. It's a principle that the Irenaeus talked about in his Adversus Heraces called anacephaliosis. And he said, of course, Christ recapitulated the ancient formation of Adam that he might bring man back to God. Christ also, though he recapitulated prophecy, Christ recapitulated prophecy in a major way when he came to his own received him not. They killed him. He rose from the dead. He ascended on high, and then he offers them the kingdom on the condition of national repentance. They refuse him again. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, the wicked are evicted from the land. They go out, and I don't know what they do. They invent a new religion or whatever. But this has been constant conflict between the two seeds. And you might can bring Islam into it. I don't know how, but it's talking about AD 70. Or it's talking about the first century, and it's talking about AD 70, something that happened in AD 70, talking about one seed that got replaced and another seed that got chosen. So you could say, well, it was the old Israel after the flesh that got replaced. But it was the same Israel. So, the 12 apostles were all Jews. So it wasn't like God was taking one group and then just throwing them aside and choosing another group. It's the same group, but it's under two different covenants. And so the ones that came over from the first covenant were the ethnic seed, and they formed the basis of the church. It's 12 Jewish foundations, and they're going to make the end of the church with 12 Jewish gates. So what we're having right now, what we're experiencing right now as Gentiles is it's one of the most remarkable things where we can come to Christ through faith alone, and not have to come in through a Jew, not have to have Jewish apostolic intermediation between ourselves and God. So all that was done away. We come to Christ, through faith in his word. And then, of course, the seed of Abraham himself, like Abraham circumcised all of his own household, the seed of Abraham, the true seed of Abraham, he circumcises all of his own household. Now, during that 40 years, they had to come through Jewish mediation. They always had to come through Jewish mediation. It isn't until you get to the destruction of Jerusalem, that's when I believe the church entered the land. Christianity came into its own, and now men are regenerated through simple faith in Christ without any need for Jewish mediation. And Christ does the circumcising. It's the seed of Abraham that circumcises his own household. So you have the children of faith, you have the children of the woman, and then you have, of course, the seed of the serpent. And there's been this continual battle back and forth down the centuries. Where it's going to end is with a great flood. And that's why it's essential to recognize this typology, to recognize the exilic nature of much of the prophecy, and say, well, a lot of this stuff didn't happen until they were evicted from the land. A lot of this stuff didn't happen until after AD 70, where now you see them enter the land and do what they're going to do. But you also see there's a conflict that comes into play, and it's because of that conflict that there's this moral crisis that happens among the nations of mankind. And then that's why God has to send the flood. So yeah, it's a global flood. But what I said to someone, a couple of weeks ago, as I said, just because it's couched in global terms, that it doesn't have to be. I mean, it doesn't matter if the flood was a historical event or not. What matters is the truth that it's teaching, the truth that it's projecting for the eyes of faith. We have no way of knowing whether the flood was global or not. We could theorize, and we can say, well, because of this, because of that, because of this, because of that. But we have no way of knowing. We have no way of knowing where the dinosaurs come in. And there's great theories out there, but then there's counter theories. You got to look at both sides. You can't just accept one body of evidence and say, well, this is the truth. But you got to look at what the other side is saying. Got to look at what other scholarship is saying. So I think that's really important. Where's it all going to end? Well, it's going to end with a flood, but before that time, there's going to be a selection of some to escape the flood. So that's why Enoch is so important. Can't get into that right now, but um, walking with God. So he's going to get into Enoch, though. He says that what an expression. Enoch walked with God. Walking with God signifies going in God's direction, keeping step with God, talking with God, at ease in God's presence, perfect confidence in God, pleasing God, no separation from God, and was not. This curious phrase is explained by Hebrews 12:5. God took him, that is to say, he was translated, he did not die, he went alive into God's heavens. In later years, another was so taken, Elijah, but there is a translation coming of which this is only a type. In 1 Corinthians 15:51 is written, we shall not all sleep, that is, die, but we should all be changed. And so he's going to use this to paint a picture of a pre-tribulation rapture. Now, I disagree with making First Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4. I'm going to take Bullinger's view on this. These verses here were tied to Israel's kingdom program. So the verse that's not tied to Israel's kingdom program would be Philippians chapter 3, where it talks about the prize of the upward calling. And Bullinger argued quite eloquently that there's a previous selection that can happen really at any time, but it's associated with the Gentile calling, with the age that would officially begin after the destruction of Jerusalem. And then these verses right here, these were imminent during that 40 years, but they're associated with Israel's kingdom program, and they would have taken place, if they did take place, they would have taken place at the end of the tribulation. So I'm going to agree with Bullinger on that. I don't think this is talking about something that could take place before the tribulation. But again, there's a lot of views. There's quite a few views. So I think that, I mean, we could go on and on and on, but basically this is a great little article. And I wanted to bring this out just to show that there's a lot more there's a lot more moving wheels and moving parts than most people think when they look at some of these old stories. And they say, typical response you're going to get is, okay, it's a story. It was probably, pulled out of someone else's hat, and whoever wrote it was, trying to make a political point or something. But again, we see this reappear, in other places. We see this constant conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And ultimately, we see that the seed of the serpent is finally destroyed, and then the seed of the woman is saved, miraculously saved. So I think that's the lesson that we should take from this, and also that these two seeds are still in the world today. And then we have to ask ourselves in our perhaps more private devotional moments, to which seed are we siding with? Are we siding with the seed of the woman, the saints of old, the saints of the Christian church? Are we siding with those who persecuted the saints? Are we siding with those who, don't like Christ, don't believe in him, don't want anything to do with him? We have to ask ourselves those questions, because it's really important. This is not an easy age to be a believer. It's really not. It's like I said in my post this morning, belief is one of the easiest things in the world. It's the easiest. God's made salvation so easy, but faith for many people is one of the hardest things in the world. And Satan's not, he's not running around trying to get us to, smoke cigarettes or drink beer or, hang out at titty bars or whatever. He's trying to get us to not believe, to say, hey, this is all just made up stuff. That's a shame. And a lot of people are falling for it. But what I do want to say is I think that it's important to recognize, if you go back through some of these old types, and you'll see, especially this book, I recommend this book highly. Again, it's called How to Study the Bible. It's been one of my most influential books over the years. I've read it several times. And like I said, between that and How to Enjoy the Bible by E.W. Bullinger, I couldn't recommend any better books other than the Bible itself. But really good stuff. Check it out, and let me know if you have any ideas. But what I will be doing during the next week is I think I'm going to be trying to prepare for another discussion. I'm going to try to get another discussion together, try to see if we can get some new faces Of course, we can't get some new faces. We'll get some old faces. So we'll do it. If you're interested, also, if you're interested in any kind of ideas for future shows or for uh, not even for shows, but for debates and for interviews or anything like that. If you have any ideas, let me know. Because to be honest with you, I work a lot. I've been working quite a bit. And I always, don't usually have time during the day to like connect with people. Like if I connect, it'll be like, all right, then a couple hours later, I'll come back. And it's really hit or miss. So if you have any ideas, let me know. But until then, thanks again for tuning in. It's been a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful journey through the scriptures and through these, these passages, these types. But I want you to get some use out of it. So go ahead, read the book, and we'll talk to you soon.